The cold waters of Sagami Bay rippled against the shattered fuselage as Japanese patrol boats converged on the floating wreckage. February 16th, 1945. The morning sun revealed what appeared to be another downed American fighter, its distinctive inverted gull wings jutting awkwardly from the surface. But this was no ordinary combat loss. This was a nearly intact F4U Corsair from USS Bunker Hill, ditched after engine trouble during the massive carrier strikes on the Tokyo area. And for Japan's aviation establishment, it represented something far more valuable than intelligence. It was evidence. For nearly 2 years, Japanese pilots had been sending back increasingly desperate reports about this American fighter. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. They described an aircraft that could outdive them, outrun them, and absorb punishment that would have disintegrated a zero. They reported firepower that seemed impossible, speed that defied logic, and a ruggedness that suggested the Americans had solved problems Japanese engineers still struggled with. But pilot reports, even from experienced aviators, were filtered through the chaos of combat, colored by fear and adrenaline. They couldn't explain the engineering behind what they witnessed in the sky. Here, bobbing in the waters off Japan's coast, was the real thing. The aircraft that had been systematically destroying Japanese naval aviation since February 1943, the fighter that Japanese pilots had learned to fear more than any other American aircraft, and now it would be pulled from the sea, transported to Yokosuka Naval Air Technical Arsenal, and examined by some of Japan's finest aeronautical engineers. What they would discover inside that massive cowling would confirm their worst suspicions about the technological chasm that had opened between American and Japanese aviation. They would measure it, document it, and understand for the first time the full magnitude of what they were facing. 2,000 horsepower, a number that represented not just an engine, but an entire industrial philosophy Japan could not match. The story of this captured Corsair is not merely about a downed aircraft or technical intelligence. It is the chronicle of a moment when Japan's aviation specialists confronted physical proof of American industrial superiority. When theories became measurements, when suspicions became certainties, and when the gap between Japanese capabilities and American achievements was laid bare in aluminum and steel. Through examination of this fighter's engine, they would learn a truth about power, precision, and production that no amount of propaganda could obscure. This is the story of that encounter, and what it revealed about the nature of industrial warfare. The Vought F4U Corsair that Japanese salvage crews pulled from Sagami Bay represented the culmination of American fighter development, but its origins stretched back to 1938. That year, the United States Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics issued specifications for a new carrier fighter that seemed almost fantastical. They wanted an aircraft capable of exceeding 400 miles per hour in level flight. At a time when most fighters struggled to reach 350 miles per hour, this specification alone was revolutionary. But the Navy demanded more than just speed. They wanted low stalling speed for carrier operations, a range of 1,000 miles, heavy armament, and the ability to carry bombs. Chance Vaught's response to this requirement was audacious. Chief designer Rex Beisel and his engineering team decided to build their entire aircraft around the most powerful engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R2000-800 Double Wasp. This decision would define everything about the Corsair, from its distinctive appearance to its combat effectiveness. The R2000-800 was an 18-cylinder, 2-row radial engine that produced 2,000 horsepower at takeoff. To put this in context, the engine alone generated nearly double the power of most contemporary fighters in service anywhere in the world. The implications of this power were immediate and profound. To harness 2,000 horses, Beisel's team needed a propeller of unprecedented size. They designed a 13-foot, 4-inch diameter propeller, the largest ever fitted to a fighter aircraft. This massive propeller created an immediate engineering challenge. How could they provide adequate ground clearance for such a large propeller while maintaining structural efficiency for carrier operations? The solution became the Corsair's most distinctive and recognizable feature. Rather than using conventional straight wings, Beissel's team created an inverted gull wing design, the wings angled downward from the fuselage before leveling out, creating a distinctive M shape when viewed from the front. This configuration allowed relatively short landing gear while still providing the necessary propeller clearance. The anhedral angle where the wing met the fuselage also created optimal aerodynamic conditions, minimizing interference drag between the wing root and fuselage. It was an elegant solution to a complex problem, one that would become iconic. The prototype F4U flew on May 29, 1940, piloted by Lyman Bullard Jr., Vaught's chief test pilot, from the company's factory airfield in Stratford, Connecticut. The flight proceeded normally until Bullard was forced to make a hurried landing when the elevator trim tabs failed due to flutter. Despite this inauspicious beginning, the prototype soon demonstrated its exceptional potential. On October 1, 1940, during a test flight between Stratford and Hartford, the F4U achieved a ground speed of 405 miles per hour with tailwind assistance. The achievement made headlines. Here was the first single-engine American fighter to reach 400 miles per hour, a milestone that captured public imagination and Navy attention. The aircraft's actual maximum level flight speed was 378 miles per hour at 23,500 feet. Still, exceptional performance for 1940. More importantly, the Corsair demonstrated that its massive engine could be successfully integrated into a carrier fighter airframe. The Navy was convinced, production orders followed, and by late 1942, F4U Corsairs began reaching operational units. But getting the Corsair into combat would prove more challenging than the Navy anticipated. The move to 650 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, created a cascade of design changes. The original wing fuel tanks had to be relocated. The only available position was in the forward fuselage, ahead of the cockpit. To accommodate this 237-gallon self-sealing fuel tank, the cockpit had to be moved aft by 32 inches. This created the Corsair's most serious deficiency. The pilot now sat behind the wing, with his view forward almost completely blocked during the critical phases of carrier landing. Combined with a vicious stall, powerful torque effects at low speed, and landing gear that often bounced on touchdown, the Corsair earned a grim nickname among Navy pilots, the Ensign Eliminator. The Navy refused to clear the F4U for carrier operations. Instead, they diverted all Corsairs to land-based Marine squadrons and filled Navy carrier units with the Grumman F6F Hellcat. The Hellcat was slightly slower than the Corsair, but it was docile and forgiving during carrier operations. This decision would prove fortuitous for the Marines. On February 12, 1943, Marine Fighter Squadron VMF 124 arrived at Henderson Field, Guadalcanal, equipped with the first combat-ready Corsairs. 2 days later, on Valentine's Day, the Corsairs saw their first combat. The debut was disastrous. During what became known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, 9 American aircraft were lost, including 2 Corsairs, multiple P-38 Lightnings, P-40 Warhawks, and bombers. Japanese defenders lost only a single Zero fighter. The 9-to-1 loss ratio in Japan's favor was so severe that daylight bombing missions to Bougainville were suspended pending tactical reassessment. The engagement demonstrated a crucial truth that superior technology alone could not guarantee victory. Tactics, experience, and proper deployment mattered equally. But American pilots adapted quickly. They learned that the Corsair's strengths lay not in turning dogfights with Zeros, but in what became known as boom and zoom tactics. The Corsair could not outturn a Zero in slow-speed maneuvering. The Japanese fighter was lighter, more agile, with a tighter turning radius. But the Corsair could outdive any Japanese fighter, outclimb it, and most importantly, outrun it. Proper tactics meant maintaining speed and altitude advantage. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Dive on enemy aircraft from above, fire a devastating burst from 650 caliber machine guns, then use superior speed to disengage before the enemy could respond. Second Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh of VMF 124 became the first Corsair ace on May 13, 1943, mastering these tactics. He would eventually achieve 21 victories. By mid-1943, Marine squadrons flying from hastily constructed coral airstrips across the Solomon Islands began exploiting the Corsair's capabilities to devastating effect. The aircraft proved capable of absorbing battle damage that would have destroyed lighter Japanese fighters. Its self-sealing fuel tanks, armor plate, and robust construction meant pilots could survive hits that would be fatal in a zero. The 650 caliber Browning machine guns provided overwhelming firepower. The 4 inboard guns carried 400 rounds each. The 2 outboard guns carried 375 rounds each, totaling 2,350 rounds. A 2-second burst from all 6 guns sent nearly 200 rounds downrange. The concentration of fire was devastating. Japanese aircraft, built light to maximize performance, had virtually no armor protection. A solid burst from a Corsair's guns could literally tear a Zero apart. As the war progressed through 1943 and 1944, the Corsair's reputation grew. Marine pilots discovered the aircraft's versatility extended far beyond air combat. By mid-1944, Corsairs regularly carried external ordnance, 1,000-pound bombs on centerline and wing racks, 8 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, or napalm canisters. This fighter-bomber capability made the Corsair invaluable for close air support during amphibious operations. During the Okinawa campaign in 1945, Corsairs flew thousands of ground attack sorties, earning the nickname Angels of Okinawa from grateful infantrymen pinned down by Japanese positions. What Japanese pilots encountered in combat told only part of the Corsair's story. From the cockpit of a Zero or other Japanese fighter, a pilot saw an opponent that was faster, stronger, more resilient. But understanding the engineering and manufacturing techniques behind these advantages required physical examination of the aircraft itself. That opportunity had been rare. Most captured Allied aircraft were damaged wrecks salvaged from crash sites, their systems destroyed by impact or fire. An intact operational example of a frontline American fighter represented an extraordinary intelligence opportunity. Japan's capability for technical analysis centered on 2 primary facilities, the Yokosuka Naval Air Technical Arsenal, south of Tokyo, and the Army Aviation Technical Research Institute at Tachikawa. These organizations had been examining captured Allied aircraft throughout the war, recovering examples from battlefields across the Pacific. Their work had provided valuable intelligence about American capabilities. Yokosuka engineers had examined portions of F-6F Hellcats, examined wreckage from P-38 Lightnings, studied crashed B-17 bombers. But most captures were incomplete or damaged. The Yokosuka facility had been conducting technical research since April 1, 1932, when it was reorganized as the Kaigun Kokusho Naval Air Arsenal. By World War II, Yokosuka employed thousands of engineers, designers, and technicians. The arsenal designed numerous Japanese naval aircraft, though actual production was contracted to companies like Aichi, Nakajima, and Mitsubishi. Yokosuka's engineers were experienced professionals who understood aircraft design at the highest level. They had the knowledge, the equipment, and the analytical capability to conduct thorough technical evaluation. When salvage crews pulled the Corsair from Sagami Bay in February 1945, they worked with urgent care. American forces were striking the Tokyo area almost daily. B-29 bombers were burning Japanese cities systematically. The war was clearly approaching its end, but that made this capture more valuable, not less. If Japan was to have any hope of developing effective countermeasures, they needed to understand exactly what they faced. The Corsair was carefully transported to Yokosuka, partially disassembled for movement but with major components intact. The initial external inspection revealed an aircraft that seemed almost brutish compared to Japanese fighters. Where the Zero emphasized elegance through extreme weight reduction, the Corsair embraced mass. It was heavier, thicker, more substantial in every dimension. Engineers walked around it slowly that first day, taking photographs, making measurements, running their hands over riveted panels. They noted the armor plate behind the pilot's seat, thick enough to stop rifle-caliber rounds. They observed the robust landing gear, built to handle brutal carrier operations. They examined the wing-mounted machine guns, with their massive ammunition boxes. Everything about the Corsair spoke to a design philosophy fundamentally different from Japanese practice. Japanese fighters prioritized maneuverability and range above all else. That meant minimum weight, which meant minimal armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, lightweight structures. The Zero could turn inside any American fighter, but it couldn't survive hits. The Corsair represented the opposite philosophy. Pilot survival, sustained firepower, rugged reliability. Performance was important, but not at the cost of survivability. But what truly captured the engineers' attention was the massive engine cowling. Even before disassembly began, they knew from intelligence reports and pilot testimony that the Corsair was powered by an extraordinarily powerful engine. But intelligence reports provided estimates, not measurements. Now they would have access to the actual power plant, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, the engine that made everything else about the Corsair possible. The disassembly began methodically. Cowling panels were carefully removed, each component photographed and documented before being set aside. As the engine was gradually exposed, the Yokosuka engineers confronted the physical reality of American engineering. The R2800 was enormous. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, each cylinder displacing over 155 cubic inches. Total displacement was 2,804 cubic inches, or 46 litres. The engine alone weighed approximately 2,300 pounds. But size wasn't what stopped the engineers in their tracks. It was the understanding of what this engine represented. 2,000 horsepower at takeoff, 2,100 horsepower at military power. The numbers were staggering. Japanese engineers knew these specifications from intelligence reports, but confronting the physical engine that could reliably produce such power was different. This wasn't a prototype or experimental design. This was a production engine, built in vast quantities, installed in thousands of aircraft. The Americans had mastered not just the design of a 2,000 horsepower engine, but its reliable manufacture at industrial scale. To understand what this meant to Japanese engineers, one must understand what Japan's aviation industry had achieved with engines by 1945. The Mitsubishi, a 6M0, Japan's most famous fighter, was powered by the Nakajima Sakai radial engine. The Sakai produced approximately 940 horsepower at takeoff in its earliest versions, increasing to around 1,130 horsepower in later variants. Even Japan's most powerful operational fighter engines, like the Mitsubishi Kasei, produced between 1,530 and 1,850 horsepower. Japan had attempted to develop more powerful engines. The Nakajima Homar, an 18-cylinder radial like the R2800, was designed to produce 1,900 horsepower. On paper, it seemed like Japan was approaching American capabilities, but the reality was far more sobering. The Homar suffered from chronic reliability problems. Its tight design made manufacturing quality control nearly impossible with Japan's industrial capabilities. Actual output at altitude was often only 1,300 to 1,650 horsepower, far below design specifications. Worse, the engines frequently failed in service, overheating or suffering mechanical breakdowns that made them dangerous to fly. The captured Corsair's R2800 represented something Japan simply had not achieved: reliable, production-ready power at 2,000 horsepower. As Yokosuka engineers examined the engine in detail, they documented design features that explained how Pratt & Whitney had achieved this performance. The cooling fin design was extraordinary. Unlike Japanese engines, which used cast or forged cooling fins, the pre-paused R2800's fins were machined from solid metal. Gang-milled cutters carved the fins directly from the cylinder head forgings, creating thin, precisely spaced fins that provided exceptional heat dissipation. The sophistication extended throughout the engine. The two-stage supercharger system allowed the engine to maintain power at high altitude. The intercooler reduced intake charge temperature, increasing density and power. Water injection provided emergency boost for combat. Every system demonstrated careful engineering backed by sophisticated manufacturing capability. The metallurgy was particularly impressive. Cylinder barrels showed consistent wall thickness and hardness. Crankshaft forgings exhibited precise grain structure. Even small components like valve springs showed uniform quality. What struck the Japanese engineers most was not any single revolutionary design feature, but rather the overall integration and quality. The R2800 wasn't dramatically more advanced than Japanese engine designs in concept. Japanese engineers understood superchargers, understood intercoolers, understood the principles of high-power radial engine design. What they couldn't match was the execution, the precision manufacturing, the quality control, the materials science, the production engineering that allowed Pratt & Whitney to build these engines reliably, in quantity, and have them perform consistently in combat. Production numbers told the story most clearly. By 1945, Pratt & Whitney had produced over 125,000 R2800 engines. These engines powered not just Corsairs, but also F6F Hellcats, P-47 Thunderbolts, B-26 Marauders, A-26 Invaders, and P-61 Black Widows. The engine was so reliable and well understood that multiple manufacturers could produce it under license. Ford Motor Company built R2000 800 seconds. Nash Kelvinator built R2000 800 seconds. The engine had become a commodity, produced at automotive scale. Japan, by contrast, struggled to produce engines at all by 1945. The Nakajima Homare, despite years of development, had only 9,089 units produced. Quality was inconsistent. Performance was unreliable. Japanese factories operated under constant threat of American air raids. Skilled workers had been conscripted. Materials were in short supply. Aluminum quality had deteriorated as access to high-grade ore was cut off by Allied submarines. Even when Japanese engineers designed excellent engines on paper, translating those designs into reliable hardware had become nearly impossible. The examination continued beyond the engine. Yokosuka engineers documented every aspect of the Corsair. The hydraulic systems were particularly revealing. Japanese aircraft typically used simpler mechanical systems where possible, as hydraulics required precision machining and high-quality seals. The Corsair's hydraulic system operated landing gear, flaps, cowl flaps, and most impressively, wing folding for carrier operations. The system used redundant pumps, high-pressure lines with proper fittings, and seals that didn't leak even after combat damage. Everything worked smoothly, reliably. The electrical system powered extensive equipment through high-quality wiring with proper insulation and organization. Circuit breakers protected individual systems. The radio equipment was compact and apparently reliable, based on the condition of components. The instruments were clear, well-arranged, and appeared to be precisely calibrated. Even small details impressed. The control cables were properly tensioned and secured. Fasteners were consistent in quality. Panel fit was precise. The aircraft felt substantial, well-made, built to last. The airframe structure revealed careful engineering throughout. The center section was a massive forging that handled all the major load paths. Wing attachment fittings were robust, designed for the violent stresses of carrier operations and combat maneuvers. The skin panels showed consistent riveting patterns with proper edge distances and rivet spacing. Inspection revealed that American manufacturers had achieved skin thickness variations within remarkably tight tolerances. This wasn't just good practice, it was precision manufacturing at a scale Japan couldn't match. Perhaps most revealing was the overall quality of materials and manufacturing. Every component, from major structural elements to small fasteners, showed consistent quality. Aluminum alloys had uniform properties. Steels were properly heat-treated. Surface finishes were smooth and professional. The Corsair had clearly been built in a well-equipped factory by trained workers, using proper tooling and quality control procedures. This overall quality stood in sharp contrast to Japanese aircraft production in 1945. Wartime shortages had forced increasing use of substitute materials in Japanese aircraft. Aluminum quality had deteriorated. Steel was in short supply. Skilled workers had been drafted into military service or lost in combat. Factories operated under constant threat of American air raids, with production dispersed to less efficient facilities to avoid concentrated bombing. Quality control suffered as production schedules demanded quantity over quality. Aircraft were being built by partially trained workers using substitute materials with inadequate tooling. The gap between Japanese and American manufacturing capability was widening, not closing. The examination of the captured Corsair occurred as Japan faced imminent defeat. By February 1945, the strategic situation was desperate. American B-29 bombers were systematically destroying Japanese cities through incendiary raids. The Navy had been shattered at Leyte Gulf. The Philippines had been liberated. Iwo Jima had fallen after horrific fighting. Okinawa would be invaded in April. American carriers operated off Japan's coast almost with impunity. In this context, the Kinko saying of Risienser Corsair examination took on somber significance. This was not intelligence gathering for future victories. There would be no new generation of Japanese fighters incorporating lessons from the Corsair. There wasn't time, there weren't resources, and increasingly, there wasn't hope. The examination was instead a final reckoning with technological reality, a moment when Japanese engineers could no longer avoid confronting the full magnitude of the industrial gap that had doomed Japan from the start. Japanese engineers at Yokosuka and Tachikawa wrote detailed technical reports documenting their findings. These reports described measurements, detailed manufacturing techniques, offered assessments of American capabilities. The tone was professional, analytical, objective, but the implications couldn't be hidden. In nearly every category examined, American technology exceeded Japanese capabilities by significant margins. The gap wasn't small or easily closed. It represented years of industrial development, massive investments in research and tooling, sophisticated supply chains, abundant resources, and most critically, manufacturing expertise at scale. The Corsair's engine represented the core of this disparity. 2,000 horsepower, reliably produced, in an engine that could be manufactured by the tens of thousands. Japan had never achieved this. The Homar was supposed to reach 1,900 horsepower, but typically produced far less. The engine was unreliable, difficult to manufacture, and impossible to produce in adequate numbers with consistent quality. Even if Japan had somehow developed a truly competitive 2,000 horsepower engine, producing it at scale would have been impossible with Japan's diminished industrial capacity. By March 1945, the strategic calculus was brutally simple. Japan had approximately 5,000 aircraft of all types remaining. Most were obsolete. Many were grounded for lack of fuel or spare parts. Training had collapsed as experienced instructors had been lost in combat and fuel for training flights was unavailable. American forces approaching Okinawa could call on thousands of carrier aircraft plus land-based air power from captured island bases. The numerical ratio wasn't just unfavorable, it was apocalyptic. The captured Corsair had helped Japanese planners understand exactly why they were losing, but understanding the problem didn't provide solutions. Some problems, once understood fully, reveal themselves to be unsolvable with available resources. Japan faced exactly that situation in the spring of 1945. The technical reports on the Corsair, carefully compiled by Yokosuka engineers, gathered dust as strategic realities overtook technical analysis. Understanding why you were losing didn't matter when the war was already lost. By war's end in August 1945, at least 2 Corsairs had been captured by Japanese forces. Evidence suggests technical personnel attempted to repair at least one aircraft toward flying condition. Photographs discovered after the war show captured Corsairs with patched wings and fuselages, indicating serious efforts to make the aircraft operational for evaluation. Whether actual flight testing occurred remains uncertain, but repair attempts indicate Japanese technical staff wanted badly to fly the Corsair to understand firsthand what American pilots experienced. When American occupation forces arrived at Yokosuka Naval Air Technical Arsenal in September 1945, they found extensive evidence of Japanese technical intelligence efforts. Captured Allied aircraft were scattered around the facility. Technical reports, drawings, and photographs documented Japanese attempts to understand Allied technology. American intelligence officers collected these materials, recognizing their value for understanding what Japan had learned about American capabilities during the war. The Japanese technical reports on the F4U Corsair, discovered by American occupation forces and now resting in archives, serve as silent witnesses to a moment when one nation's engineers confronted another nation's capabilities. The Corsair they examined has long since vanished, likely scrapped during the chaotic post-war period when thousands of aircraft from all nations were reduced to scrap metal. But the encounter left its mark on both sides. For American intelligence officers, the Japanese technical reports revealed just how thoroughly Japanese engineers understood the Corsair's strengths. The analysis was professional, accurate, and remarkably detailed. It demonstrated that Japan's aviation establishment possessed sophisticated engineering expertise. They weren't losing because of inferior knowledge or incompetent design. They were losing because of industrial capacity, because manufacturing capability matters more than design elegance, because wars are won by nations that can produce weapons reliably, in quantity, with consistent quality. For Japanese engineers, the Corsair examination represented a moment of clarity. Many had suspected the magnitude of American industrial superiority, but suspicion and certainty are different things. The Corsair provided certainty. Its engine, in particular, represented a level of achievement Japan simply couldn't match, not because Japanese engineers lacked understanding, but because Japan lacked the industrial infrastructure, the resource base, the manufacturing expertise at scale, necessary to translate understanding into hardware. The story of Japan's encounter with the captured Corsair represents more than technical intelligence. It symbolizes the vast gulf separating American and Japanese industrial capability by war's end. When the Corsair first entered combat in early 1943, Japanese pilots in Zero fighters could still compete effectively through superior tactics and pilot skill. The Zero's maneuverability remained formidable. Experienced Japanese pilots knew how to exploit the Corsair's weaknesses, but by 1945, even experienced Japanese pilots in more modern aircraft stood little chance against well-flown Corsairs. The aircraft's technological advantages, combined with overwhelming American numerical superiority and systematically better pilot training, created impossible odds. The Corsair achieved an official kill ratio of 11-1 against Japanese aircraft. American pilots flying Corsairs shot down 2,140 Japanese aircraft while losing only 189 Corsairs to enemy action during World War II. These numbers reflected not just the Corsair's technological superiority, but the entire American war machine's advantages. Better training produced pilots who could fully exploit the Corsair's capabilities. Superior logistics meant aircraft were properly maintained with adequate spare parts. Overwhelming production capacity ensured losses could be replaced quickly with improved models. Advanced technology at every level, from engines to instruments to weapons, provided tangible combat advantages. Japanese engineers examining the captured Corsair understood all of this. They could measure the performance gap, analyze the manufacturing differences, calculate the resource disparities. Their reports documenting these findings stand as acknowledgments of Japan's failed attempt to match American industrial might. The recognition came too late to change outcomes, but it shaped post-war understanding. Japanese engineers and scientists who had struggled against material shortages and industrial limitations during the war worked with American occupation authorities after the war to rebuild Japanese industry. Lessons learned from examining American technology, including the Corsair, influenced post-war Japanese manufacturing philosophy. The emphasis on quality, precision manufacturing, and continuous improvement that characterizes modern Japanese industry has roots in the hard lessons learned when Japanese engineers examined what American industry could produce. The gap wasn't just about resources or scale, it was about manufacturing philosophy, quality control systems, and systematic approaches to production that Japan studied carefully during the occupation period. The Corsair itself went on to long service beyond World War II. It fought in the Korean War from 1950 to 1953, where it proved effective in ground attack and close air support roles, even as jet fighters took over air superiority missions. The aircraft's rugged construction and heavy payload capacity made it ideal for striking ground targets. Marine and Navy pilots flying Corsairs supported United Nations forces throughout the Korean Peninsula, attacking enemy supply lines, supporting ground troops, and interdicting night attacks. Foreign air forces flew Corsairs long after American forces retired them. France used Corsairs extensively in Indochina during the First Indochina War, operating from aircraft carriers. The aircraft's ability to carry heavy bomb loads made it valuable for close air support missions. French pilots flew Corsairs until the mid-1960s, long after most World War II-era fighters had been retired. The last combat missions by Corsairs occurred in July 1969 during the brief soccer war between Honduras and El Salvador. On July 17, 1969, Honduran Captain Fernando Soto, flying an F4U shot down 3 Salvadoran aircraft, including 2 FG-1D Corsairs. The final combat victories for the type were ironically achieved against other Corsairs. From its first flight in 1940 to its final combat missions nearly 30 years later, the Corsair proved one of aviation history's most successful and long-lived fighter designs. Few World War II aircraft remained in combat service so long. For Japan, the encounter with the Corsair was part of a larger reckoning with technological reality during the American occupation. Japanese engineers and scientists who had worked in aviation during the war found themselves collaborating with American technical advisors to rebuild Japanese industry. The process involved honest assessment of where Japan's industrial capabilities had fallen short. The Corsair examination, along with studies of other captured American equipment, provided specific examples of manufacturing techniques and quality control procedures Japan needed to adopt. This wasn't simply copying American technology. It was understanding the systematic approaches to manufacturing that allowed American industry to produce complex equipment reliably at scale. The lessons extended far beyond aircraft engines. Japanese manufacturers studied American approaches to tooling design, production line organization, quality control procedures, supply chain management, and worker training. These lessons, combined with traditional Japanese emphasis on craftsmanship and continuous improvement, would eventually produce the manufacturing powerhouse Japan became in the post-war era. The Corsair, recovered in February 1945, represented more than a downed fighter. It was evidence of engineering excellence and manufacturing sophistication that Japanese aviation had been seeking throughout the war. The lessons it taught came too late to change the war's outcome, but they helped shape the peace that followed. In examining this American fighter, Japanese engineers confronted the full magnitude of the challenge Japan had faced. They had fought with courage and skill, but courage and skill could not overcome the massive technological and industrial advantages their opponent possessed. The examination of the F4U Corsair by Japanese technical personnel in 1945 stands as a watershed moment. The point when Japan's aviation establishment fully grasped the technological chasm that had opened during the war years. It was a lesson written not in propaganda or combat reports, but in aluminum alloys, precision forgings, manufacturing tolerances, and above all, in 18 cylinders, producing 2,000 horsepower reliably, consistently, in quantities Japan could never match. The engine, more than anything else, represented the core truth Japanese engineers confronted. Power isn't just about design specifications or theoretical capabilities. It's about translating design into reality, reliably at scale, with consistent quality. The R-2800 Double Wasp achieved this. Japan's Homare did not. That difference, multiplied across thousands of aircraft and hundreds of thousands of engines, determined the outcome of the Pacific Air War far more than any individual pilot's skill or any particular aircraft's maneuverability. Japanese technical reports on the Corsair, discovered by American forces and preserved in archives, tell the story with professional detachment. But between the lines, in the careful measurements and detailed observations, one can sense the recognition that came to those engineers. The understanding that Japan had been attempting the impossible, not because Japanese designers lacked skill or knowledge, but because industrial warfare rewards manufacturing capability above almost everything else. The Corsair they examined has vanished into history, likely scrapped in the post-war chaos. But its legacy remains in those technical reports, in the lessons learned, in the post-war transformation of Japanese industry. The encounter between Japanese engineers and that captured American fighter represents a moment when theory met reality, when assumptions confronted evidence, when one nation's engineers measured their capabilities against another's achievements and had to acknowledge the gap. In examining that massive Pratt & Whitney engine, counting 18 cylinders, measuring bore and stroke, calculating displacement, and understanding it, represented 2,000 horsepower reliably produced by the tens of thousands. Japanese engineers confronted a truth about modern warfare. Victory flows not from courage alone, not from tactical brilliance alone, not even from technological innovation alone. Victory flows from the ability to translate innovation into production, to manufacture excellence at scale, to maintain quality while achieving quantity. America possessed that ability in 1945. Japan did not. The Corsair's engine proved it, measured it, documented it. 2,000 horsepower, a number that represented not just mechanical power, but industrial power. The power to design, to manufacture, to produce, to maintain. The power that determined the outcome of the Pacific War more than any other single factor. Japanese engineers admitted they had never seen anything like it because they hadn't. And in that admission lay the recognition of defeat, not just in one battle or one campaign, but in the fundamental struggle of industrial production that determined which nation would prevail. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.